Our next panel is about sustainable innovation and public-private partnerships. How can innovation and public-private partnerships contribute to implementing the 2030 goals for sustainable development? This is high on the agenda for many organizations across the globe, so we're super interested and excited to have this panel here. Our great panelists today will be the Danish climate ambassador, Tomas Anker Christensen, Jeppe Høier, partner at Maersk Growth, and Ida Boesen, Commoditrader co-founder. And then I have the absolute pleasure of these lovely ladies here in the studio. We have Kirsten, CEO and founder of 2030 and Beyond, previous Minister of Environment. And then, of course, our great moderator, Dr. Poornima Luthra. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. As a Singaporean living in Copenhagen, it's a great pleasure to be moderating this panel for this Copenhagen FinTech Festival and Singapore FinTech Festival 2020. I've got an amazing set of panelists with me today to get into this topic around sustainable innovation and public-private partnerships. Before we get into that, I think it'd be really nice for all of us to get to know our panelists a little bit better. And so I'm going to invite each of them to say a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get into the topic itself. So Thomas, would you like to start off and tell us a little bit about who you are and your role, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Poornima, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, in Singapore. I'm the climate ambassador of Denmark. I've been in this job for about 8 to 9 months, most of it locked down and working from home, unfortunately. In a previous life, I worked for the UN Secretary General as his senior advisor for partnerships and helped to bring the concept of partnerships and working with the private sector and investors into the very fabric of how the UN and the, if you want, the global community develops ideas and sets frameworks and tries to create the right enabling environment at global level for moving things forward on, especially the green agenda, the global goals. We brought business into the very fabric of what became the Paris Agreement on climate and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that sort of partnership approach has very much become a way of working, not only for Denmark, but in a way for the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Jeppe, can we have you next, please?
Yeah, I've been working now 13 years in venture capital and corporate venture capital, starting with Sunstone Capital out of Copenhagen, and then being invited in to join the Maersk Corporate Venture Capital Fund in early 2018, where we invest in everything supply chain, also enable trade, where we have more the fintech-related companies within AML, KYC, trade finance, factoring, and so forth, looking deeply into how sustainability is changing the investment environment and also the life of the founders of these great startups that the world will see in the decades to come.
Thank you, Jeppe. And next we have Ida.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, I'm from the beginning a farmer's daughter who has spent the last 10 years working within food and agriculture. And a couple of years ago, we started and I was co-founding a trading platform connecting farmers across Europe to get better conditions in terms of the trade. But now we're also looking very much into using that as a platform for enhancing the green possibilities and the CO2 certification of farmers by moving them into more, better ways of producing. So that's what I'm focusing on and spending all of my time on, really getting the farmers to produce better, both more sustainably, economically, and environmentally.
Great, thank you very much, Ida. And of course, I've got Kirsten here with me. Kirsten, would you like to tell everyone about yourself?
So I have a background in politics. I was a member of the Danish Parliament for 14 years, also served as the Minister of Environment for a while. And in my last term in Parliament, I founded and chaired the Danish All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've been working very much on implementation of the 2030 Agenda and stepped down from Parliament last year. And now I have founded my own nonprofit, a do tank for the SDGs called 2030 Beyond. which works to accelerate action around the SDGs. And we work primarily with parliamentarians. We have an initiative, Parliamentarians for the Global Goals, that convenes and connects parliamentarians all over the world to support them and help them to share best practices and give them tools and guides how to implement SDGs in their parliamentary work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kirsten. And my name is Poornima, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. I am the founder of Talented Consultancy, which takes a look at really embracing diversity and inclusion in our workplaces and society. So let's get into this. So Ida, I'm going to start with you. What do you think sustainability in FinTech actually means from your perspective, from where you are?
I think for some of the tools that we're using in the FinTech space is really key for enabling different producers, especially to produce better and to make it valuable what they do, the difference that they can make. So if we look at farmers, for example, making technical solution that digitalize the way of working for them makes it possible to, for example, measure what it is that they're doing, quantifying it, and making it work as a tradable asset, you can say. So for us, we work with CO2 certificates, and this is a new market for farmers, you can say, where they can really start to produce in a different way that is more climate friendly. They can store carbon into the soil by the photosynthesis of the plants, and that is basically out in the fields. But if we don't manage to get the right sources or the right tools to translate that into tradable assets, there's no financial solution or no financial support for them in doing what they need to do to really make a difference in the world. And farmers can really make a huge difference. So that's really for us to look at how can we get the best tools. Is it blockchain? Is it different types of technical solutions, regulations, etc., within the FinTech space that can enhance the way farmers produce better?
Thank you, Ida. Jeppe, I'm going to jump to you now and pick your brain around what is it the role of sustainability with investment as from where you are sitting and your experience?
I think from my side and looking at sustainability within everything we do. So for me, it's a focus on the digital sector and what the digital sector can do to move the agenda. We see, with my focus primarily being on Germany, we see 60% of the first-time founders having a sustainability focus in what they do. So it's a movement that is coming. It's for everybody to contribute with, and like founders like Ida that go out and spread the word that we need to do something is super important. From the investor side, it is coming, right? We need to see the CO2 emissions that are coming from the investments we do. We need a focus on diversity and more of the ESG goals that are out there, right? So it's a focus. It's something that we speak about now. And the most happy thing for me is that founders are now asking their investors, where your money coming from? Is it green money or is it black money? And I think that is super important that we keep addressing this. So for us and as an investor, right, CO2 emissions is a thing we look at. Diversity is a clear thing we look at, and we need to bring that into motion for all the founders to have a focus on, because they're the new stars of the world. They're the new superheroes, right? Everybody looks up to these founders, so it's super important that they have a clear focus on sustainability and just start doing something, right? Everything is great when you do something within sustainability, so we just need to push it.
Wonderful, Jeppe. Now, as we've heard from both Ida and Jeppe, I think the next natural question for you, Thomas, is what is the role of public-private partnerships in making this happen, both for those on the ground like Ida, as well as investors and those looking at investment like Jeppe? Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. I think public-private partnerships is a way, a mindset, a way of sending the signals to the political side, what the right regulatory frameworks and enabling conditions are for then taking the action that companies and investors want to take. And sometimes they need the government or local authorities to step in, and other times they don't. I mean, then the framework is already there. And in the Nordic countries, in Denmark, we have a long tradition for having that dialogue back and forth. The Danish government has just set a legally binding framework for climate, which asks us to reduce our emissions by 70% by 2030. And we realize that can only be done in a partnership with the private sector. So with Danish business and Danish industry, 13 public-private partnerships sectorally have been established that work on all sectors of the economy to reduce emissions. And these partnerships have come forward with proposals saying, this is how much we can do within, say, shipping or aviation or heavy-duty trucking or energy. This is how much we can do on our own. And this is where we need the government or authorities to step in and put the right regulatory framework. And in a European context, it might not even be something the Danish government can do, but something we need to go to a European level to implement or get solved. And so the government has also put forward a global climate strategy, which I'm in charge of coordinating. And within that, public-private cooperation is really at the heart of moving much of the action forward. Many companies are now signing on to what's called net zero emissions in 2050. They are working with so-called science-based targets to drive greening through their value chain, through their supply chain. And in that sense, public-private cooperation has to be a win-win for all parties engaged. And as a Denmark, we are doing that outside Denmark in our bilateral work with a number of countries, where we also try to bring government technical work into collaboration with the private sector, say in China on food waste, or in Colombia on modern pork production, or in Kenya on rural development and sustainable dairy production, or in Indonesia on food loss and waste. We also try to do it sectorally, working with Maersk as a shipping company to drive down emissions from shipping, and something called the Getting to Zero Coalition for shipping, where they've set a target for emissions to totally, carbon emission-free shipping by 2050. And then also at the global level, Denmark is trying to work with a number of countries and private sector companies on driving partnerships for sustainable development and the global goals in something called the P4G. So we are really trying to drive it through bilateral, sectorally, and globally. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Kirsten, I'm going to ask you now, then what would it take to make these public-private partnerships the most effective that they can be?
Well, I think, we have, as Thomas says, some good experiences, but there are also, things that we have to be aware of when we establish partnerships like this. Now, Thomas is mentioning the 13 climate partnerships that the Danish government has established with the private sector. But what I think is extremely important is that we have sort of a common ground that we start, when we start a partnership off, we need to know what is exactly the goal we're working to achieve together, so that we have a common ground and also have the same expectations as to when these 13 climate partnerships, for instance, come up with their solutions and suggestions to the politicians, then how will that be taken in by the politicians? Because otherwise we will see partnerships established and there's a lot of hype around it, but then, it is never really implemented. I obviously hope to see that the solutions, when we invite private sector or civil society into these partnerships, that we also see actual decisions being made on the back of that. So I think that's extremely important, to have that respect for people's time when you invite them in. But then obviously also, I think, we have some really good examples that this can actually work, and that for change to happen, we need both, mass mobilization of civil society, we need the innovation power of the private sector, and we need political will, and the will to actually invest public funding as well. So you need really to have the same perspective for when entering into this partnership.
Absolutely. So one of the challenges, of course, is making sure that we have the same perspective and we're all working towards the same goals. I guess I'd like to ask all of you right now to take a look at what are those possible challenges with kind of fostering these public-private partnerships. And Ida, maybe I can start with you, with your views on the ground as you work with Commoditrader.
Yeah, we experience a lot of questions from farmers because at the same time as we're developing a CO2 capture certificate program on farm level, a lot of things are going on in the EU where the Parliament and the Commission, etc., are discussing the new regulations and the new setup for farmers, which means the support that farmers get from EU has been discussed for many years. Now the discussions has gone into should the farm level support be dependent on climate actions or environmental actions in general. Right now there are discussions about that 30 to 40% of the support to farm level should be dependent in the future on climate actions. The same climate actions that farmers can get certificates based on that can be sold into a private market that is driven by big banks, corporate institutions, oil companies, etc., who wants to move towards climate goals or greenhouse gas emission targets. So that means that at the same time we have EU working in the same directions as the private markets, which creates a situation where farmers, who are the ones who need to act on this, keep asking, so what happens then if I enter the private market, I get the certificates, I change my practices and sell certificates based on that. I reduce the CO2 emissions quite a lot. I take carbon and CO2 out of the atmosphere, store carbon in the soil from new processes that they need to invest heavily in to move forward towards a more climate-friendly goal. They can get paid for that through private markets. But at the same time, they're waiting clear signals from the EU about what happens if they end up selling certificates to the private market while the public sector is moving in the same direction, but with different frameworks. So right now we are on the farm, or in the agricultural sector at least, we're very much looking at a space that is filled with a lot of good intentions, with the same goals, but goals that can eventually end up postponing the development until maybe 23, maybe even to 2030, because that are the timeline we are working within. And everyone asks the same questions. So what does it make if the private sector makes the farmers move and make them reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time EU is moving in the same direction but putting down regulations on top that can actually make it problematic that the farmers has already sold certificates and having co-financed from the private markets on these actions that they can make. So that's some of the issues that we're running into, because we all want to move in the same direction for the same targets. But the collaboration between private and public sector is really key in this aspect, because farmers are not big companies that we can talk to and set targets together with. Farmers are really individual small companies in a very large scale with a very large impact.
Thank you, Ida. So, Thomas, I'm going to come to you now and ask you for your response towards what Ida has, the picture that Ida has painted.
Well, I think that part of the challenge Ida is pointing to is the signaling between the government level and the private level, and to get that in a way mode of signaling right, and especially when it then goes at a European level to the kind of supranational level, which is the European institutions, which for those who are listening to this and are not well versed in European policy making, is quite a beast on its own, with both a commission and a parliament and governments who are all sort of have to agree. And I can easily understand why that for a farmer in Denmark can be quite a fog to navigate through. And that's why I think the collaboration also between the Danish actors and the Danish government and the other institutional actors from Denmark who are active in Brussels has to be very close. We can also see that I mentioned shipping before, but in shipping there's a global maritime authority that in a way is the body where governments coordinate targets for emissions from the shipping industry. And Maersk has this very ambitious target of 100% decarbonizing shipping by 2050, but the global target from the governments in the IMO is only 50 to 70%. So there's a disconnect there, and we from the Danish government side, we want the global community to be more ambitious, but it's not our own decision. And that's why I think this in Denmark, the close cooperation between the private sector and the government, and then also at the global stage, is pretty important. And I would guess that for other countries that is the same, and that makes it quite complex to move the scale at a global level. But that's the art of getting it done. That's to find out the ways to do that sector by sector and issue by issue.
Of course, it's an art in itself. And so, Kirsten, what about you? What do you think your thoughts are, and what Ida and Thomas have shared with us?
Well, I completely agree that it can be definitely a challenge to see through all the different levels of regulation and government that you have to work with as a private business representative. So in my case now, working with parliamentarians all over the world, I would maybe point to also the challenge that maybe in Denmark we have good experiences and good traditions of this public-private partnership, but it is definitely not the case in all over the world. So there are huge challenges with lack of transparency and corruption and these issues that really sometimes can hinder a fruitful conversation between the sectors, and also for civil society to be able to be part of that conversation, which is so important also to include that voice. So we definitely still need to work with developing these best practices of public-private partnerships, sharing them, and seeing how we can support the further development of these models, also to challenge these issues of lack of transparency and corruption, etc.
And what about Jeppe? What about you from your perspective, where you're sitting as you're hearing the three previous panelists speak? What are your thoughts on this?
From my side, there's a clear path to how to change the future. I think it comes from a bottom-up approach. In the ecosystem, when we speak to founders and startups, it's super interesting to see how they try to solve some of these problems that are out there, right? Especially CO2 emissions is the target, right? And I think when we look at the electrification, especially within logistics and transport, I see more and more of these startups coming to solve the bigger problems. So for us, when we invest, we're not that dependent on what the partnerships they do, right? We're trying to target the problem immediately and go for solutions, and that is also what we do in Maersk, right? We set the standards high. We try to get to solutions before time really runs out, right? And that also means for Maersk, right, that by 2030 we need to have a solution for green fuels for our vessels, right? And that is clearly the target, right? Because our fleet has a 20-year rotation scheme, right? So we need to start doing something now, and that is what we will be doing.
Absolutely wonderful. Thomas, I want to come to you for a moment and ask you this question. What does it mean for governments to appoint a climate ambassador? That's a really interesting title that you have, and I'm sure our viewers out there are wondering what this title entails and what it means. So, Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. In the Danish case, my role is appointed by the Prime Minister and to support the government in its global outreach. As I said, the Parliament has set this very ambitious 70% emission reduction target for 2030, but they've also made it clear that only really makes sense for Denmark, since we only have 0.1% of global emissions, to have that high level of ambition if we use that to move the needle on global climate change. And my role with working with both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Development, Trade, European Affairs colleagues, but also Ministry of Climate and Energy, is in a way to build the strategy and implement it for how we have an impact worldwide. That is through government-to-government relations, working with the Danish business community through our development aid, and of course also on climate diplomacy outreach to other diplomats and within the UN negotiations. But it's really trying to become a green foreign service and a green country as we engage with the rest of the world. it's quite many levels of engagement, but I would say for both the Danish government and the Danish embassies, and I think the Danish business sector, it makes a lot of sense. And by using both diplomacy, the technical cooperation, and the business side, we actually have a bigger impact than each of these parts on their own.
Thank you, Thomas. And hopefully this will inspire other countries to think about this very role in itself, isn't it? So as we come to the end of today's panel, I would like each of our participants, panelists, to wrap up their final thoughts around sustainable innovation and the role of public and private partnerships. So Jeppe, I'm going to start with you. What are your final thoughts, your final message to our audience?
I think my message is that it comes from within, right? It comes from each one of us. Everything that we do around sustainability will help improve the conditions of our planet and secure it for our daughters and sons, right, in the future. I think we need to focus on this, right? For me, I'm a member of Leaders for Climate Action, and we're rolling out this in the digital industry, right? It is a focus for each one of us, for our companies, for investors, for the whole ecosystem. So we need to highlight this in everything we do and move the agenda forward.
Thank you, Jeppe. And what about Ida? Your final thoughts for our viewers?
I think that we all need to keep searching for good solutions, for more sustainable actions, and for all the tools that we can find to really move things forward. And I think it's good that governments, private sector, everyone really looks around what is happening out there and what are the tools, not only locally on national level or similar, but also across the world. We see different types of development everywhere, and we should bring it all in, doing it together.
Thank you, Ida. What about you, Thomas? What are your parting words for our audience today?
We live in the time of a global pandemic where we have begun listening to science again. And in many ways, science and public-private collaboration is the solution to getting out of the pandemic. The same way when we move forward on climate and the green space to save our planet from the bigger threats, we have to listen to science, and then we have to do it in a public-private collaboration, because public-private partnerships are the most powerful instruments to implement the ambition of getting to a decarbonized society and, in a way, moving forward on the long term.
Thank you, Thomas. And over to you, Kirsten, your final thoughts?
Well, my final point on public-private partnerships, and maybe also sharing the experience of Denmark and how we have arrived where we are today with a very ambitious climate deal that is being rolled out. I would say the importance of the politicians of setting long-term ambitious goals, because this is what it takes also for the private sector to be able to innovate and to be able to, use that push from the political side also to keep being innovative, because that will bring us to the next level, and that will help us provide the solutions for the future that can also be rolled out in the rest of the world. So clear and stable long-term targets, which is creating that space for innovation.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you're walking away with some really good tips and ideas on how to make this actually work, what the challenges are, going in with your eyes open. And really, this is a real need across the world, this public and private partnerships to enable many of the things when it comes to the sustainability agenda. So thank you very much for joining us today, and wishing you a wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year to 2021. Thank you.